Welcome to the WebID breakout session. My name is Ken. Majid and Sam are also on this call. We're at Google and we're engineers on the Chrome team, and we've been working on some web platform identity projects for a little while. And in particular, this project called WebID, which you can read about here. This is how it's been moved into, we have a repo in the YCG. Lots of information is there, a lot more than I'm going to be able to present in this. So this is more of a high-level overview. We welcome feedback and discussion. And one note about the name, which has come up, is that there actually is already a WebID within the W3C. So there's a bit of a naming conflict, and that refers to an identity data structure and a protocol. Where we're talking about trying to define a new API. And exactly what to do about that name is TBD. So this session we're discussing is we're first going to go over the problem and exactly why this project was spun up. It has to do with federated identity, and in particular the privacy changes that are happening on the web. We're going to go over that to try to get a shape of the problem and kind of get us toward the right mindset to think about how to solve it. We're going to give sort of the framework we're using to think about how to solve it, which is we don't have a specific solution in mind. We've done a lot of work trying to identify trade-offs and try to bucket the general approaches we can use and figure, in large part, ask the right questions that'll let us go forward. And then there's a little bit at the end talking about where we're going from here, like the challenges and the community engagement that we're looking forward to. Okay, so federated identity on the web. We think this is a really good thing to exist. It makes sign-in for accounts on most websites much easier and more secure and better for users. You can see, I expect most people here understand how that works, or have seen this on the web in some ways. You can typically, this website, which we would call a relying party, which is the site that you're going to create an account in or sign into, might offer you a way you can enter in your email address or some other username and then a password to create an account, or you can log in, sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, sign in with Apple, or others. There's which is one of the larger identity providers that exists on the site, on the web. Sorry. Identity provider is the term that we use for those services that can provide identity across origins to these to the relying parties. So I'll be using those terms a lot: relying party or RP, and identity provider or IDP throughout this. Now, this is good on the web. As I mentioned, the IDPs can basically take on a lot of the security responsibility and invest a lot in it. Account protection, abuse mitigation, and ways that offloads that responsibility from relying parties. And also it just makes it easy for users because you don't have to have passwords, a separate password for every site, which causes all sorts of problems. So the problem is, these protocols that enable federated identity to work are built on top of the web. They're not a part of the web per se. They exist independent of the web, I should say, because like you think of OAuth and OpenID Connect and SAML, and they're standards, and then there's ways that they are integrated into the web to make these flows work. But essentially, they just rely on the primitives that the web offers. And some of these, and at its heart, federated identity relies on different origins being able to exchange identifying information, which becomes a problem when we're trying to change the web or change some of the behaviors of these primitives to improve privacy. One example is all the browsers have made efforts to limit third-party cookie access, or all the major browsers, I should say. so that when an iframe is loaded within another web page, it doesn't necessarily have access to the same cookies it had when you loaded it as a top-level frame. This is problematic for some of the use cases of federated identity. In this case, you see personalized sign-in button at the bottom, which is that an iframe that's loaded and can see that who you are signed in as with the identity provider and offer you an option to sign in that way. Becomes a problem. There are also flows like reauthentication, like silent reauthentication, that can use third-party cookies, and identity providers need to figure out a way to deal with that, or as best they can, as those cookies get locked down. A larger looming problem is that as cookies become less useful for trackers, another tracking vector is essentially just passing information, identifying information across navigations, top-level navigations, where all sites have access to their first-party cookies. So we've seen this called navigational or bounce tracking, and there isn't, as far as I know, there's not a consensus on exactly what to do about this yet. But this is technically indistinguishable from how most federated sign-ins work on the web. So anything we do to mitigate this, to give users more control over this kind of tracking, will negatively impact federated sign-in, and could possibly make it unusable or unpalatable for relying parties or users, and which would decrease its usage and potentially, in our worst case, force users back into just simply using usernames and passwords on every site on the web, and creating all the attendant problems from that. So we have a name for this. We call it the classification problem, which is to say we want information to be able to pass between sites, but we want it to be able to pass for specific purposes. And it's hard for the user agent to be able to classify, classify what data is for what purpose. So we might say that we want that users may want to allow this identifying information between identity providers and relying parties for the sake of signing in, but they may choose not to allow it for other kinds of uses. And I'll add a note about the graphics here throughout is that we use colors, and this is these are kind of simple mocks that we drew up. We use colors to try to distinguish who's drawing what. So for instance, on this page, the browser Chrome is at the top in green. The relying party page, which is the site you're signing into, is gray, and you can see iframes from the IDPs in blue and light blue and orange there. So we'll be using conventions like that to try to, because those are important as we talk about the user flows as we go forward. Okay, so relying party consequences of web identity. So one of the problems that we have, one of the, up until previously on this, we've been talking about the problems if we try to make web primitives more better under user control and more private, or privacy enabling, then we have then basically we have to adapt federated identity to work with that. But there are also some specific problems to how identity works, and that also can create its own set of privacy, that has its own set of privacy consequences. One of them is simply the act of signing in, which is not just federated identity, but all identity. Like when you provide an email address to a website from an identity provider, or simply from an autofill, or type it in manually, you provide the RP global knowledge of who you are, which can be correlated with other relying parties' knowledge of who you are, and generally, every place that your website appears on the internet. An issue with that is that it can be that's completely beyond user control. That those can be used to effectively do database joins and create a tracking profile of that user, which is this is something we'd also like to mitigate, because we see this as sort of one of the easier ways to create tracking profiles when some of the other ways become harder. And on the flip side of that, something inherent to federated sign-in as it works today is that the identity provider can create a profile simply because they know every site that you use to sign in, that you sign in, do a federated sign-in into, or any kind of authorization. And this has some advantages for the user, like you can manage the permissions that you're granting to your account access or your information, but it also is not, if a user wants to use federated sign-in and not have this risk, then they don't really have control of it because it's inherent to how it works. Okay, so talking about what we're trying to actually cover in this, there's a few things that we're kind of not really thinking about right now that are generally in the space. So we've been asked about a few times. One thing is identity providers have the ability to impersonate users using federated sign-in, and that's hard to solve. It's not an immediate goal, but it would be something that would be nice if we could do. We're not too focused on the issue of that, like, cross-device sign-in state, and it would also be nice if you could carry sign-ins and sign-in sessions credentials across devices or across browsing sessions in some way, and we're not trying to tackle that yet. And another one for federated identity, and I don't know if this is how commonly this term is known, but it's often called the NASCAR flag problem, which is going back a bit, you see that there's a sign-in with A and a sign-in with B on the relying party. Hypothetically, if there are 6 widely used identity providers, then you could have 6 buttons there to have to sign in, which is like, the decals on a NASCAR that you could, and that's not appealing or user-friendly. So it tends to make sites want to limit how many identity providers they can support, which is not great for the ecosystem. And it would be better if we could provide a way that they could, a more user-friendly way for users to select which IDP they want to use. But also, that's also not what we're trying to tackle at this point. A big one, which we are thinking about, but we don't have sound solutions for yet, is enterprise use cases. Because what we're talking about with federated sign-in with identity providers on the web is really just one slice of this giant identity ecosystem. There are many, many other ways it's used in enterprise and EDU, in institutional usage, government. And they have different privacy requirements, so they may not care as much about the goals that we're trying to do. And to be honest, we're not even sure we know all the use cases yet, because it's hard to identify in many of the corner cases. So we're trying to engage and get better answers on this, but right now we're not discussing exactly how that's going to go. And so we move on to here's what we are thinking. Yeah, this is important. We don't really have answers yet. I kind of want to keep stressing this, that we're not trying to push us. It's not like discussion has mostly been within Google. We've been reaching out to other browsers, having some external discussions. We've been reaching out to the identity community, but there are more questions than answers, and we are still trying to shape it. And in part, that's why we don't have a firm proposal yet. It is something we have sort of a more of a framework and how we're thinking about solving it as we try to get more information. And this is the reason it's hard, because the ecosystem is really complicated. We, as I mentioned, we don't necessarily know all the use cases that should be covered by this. It's hard. There are really difficult trade-offs between usability, privacy properties, and also offering developer control of the user experience. And because this OpenID Connect has been rolling out for something like a decade and has been increased, there's a question of how easy can we adapt the web to a new API, and what would be the timeline of doing that. So all these questions are sort of weighing into where we're going. One thing that's a little bit separate that's orthogonal to some of the other stuff we're going to talk about is this notion of directed identifiers, which tries to solve the problem I talked about when I said RPs can do a database join and correlate all the email addresses that they have to build a tracking profile. Something we would like to build in, and this exists in existing standards, at least the notion exists, although there's no, it's only used in fairly limited contexts as far as I know. But A directed identifier is one, so it's essentially a derived identifier from. So you have a global identifier such as your email address. A directed identifier is something that can't be correlated, and that effectively every time you sign into a new relying party, they would get a different picture of who you are. And then there's a one-way mapping from your global identity to each directed identifier. Oh, sorry, was there a no? Okay, I just noticed there was a chat. No, I'm not sure I understand. Well, we can talk after, if that's okay. Right. Sorry for the interruption. Right, so we would like this to be part of the solution that identity providers offering the capability for directed identifiers to exist. So this is say, and we do see an example of this. Apple has been using it as part of their federated identity system, which they call their Hide My Email feature. But if we could have a standardized way of doing that on the web, and one of the things we're thinking about is this notion of verifiably directed identifiers, which allows the browser to positively assert that an identifier is directed and it's not global and it can't be correlated. That can be done using hashing. So that's a little bit orthogonal. It has some trade-offs built into it as well. It's also, orthogonal to the other things we're going to talk about, which is the high-level approaches I'm moving on to now. As we sort of brainstormed all the different ways that we could do this, they sort of naturally fell into sort of three buckets of like, how do we actually think about this working, this API? What does it actually do? So the first and simplest is that we can just think of it as like a new permission on the web. So we can say, well, do you give permission to the IDP to give identifying information to the relying party? And please understand that there's some tracking risks according to it. In each of these variations, there are questions underneath them that could affect how it's shaped. But at a high level, that's, we can think of it as maybe this is what that API simply needs to do. It simply needs to say, we're going to exchange some information back and forth. There's some tracking risk. Please make the browser or user agent, please make sure that the user is aware of it and is okay with that. A second approach is a little bit more invasive in that the browser would actually mediate the protocols and take on some of the identity provider's responsibilities into its own UI, which can provide some more user-friendly flows because it can condense permission prompts and make things clearer, but also offers a lot less developer flexibility. And a third one is a little further out, which is to somewhat think if we deprioritize if we say, well, this is hard to deploy, so let's make it really hard to deploy and then not to worry about backwards compatibility at all. We can sort of rethink how federation works and come up with something better, which would be kind of redefining the role of the identity provider in the federated ecosystem. So that would, in a way, that would be creating something new that eventually would aim to replace what happens today in the web. And as with all of them, there are significant trade-offs with it. So this is an example of the first time in the permission-oriented approach. So if we think about it as permissions, and the first time you try to sign into a relying party with a given identity provider, what it might look like. So the green section is browser UI. So you can see at the bottom in the first screen and the last, it's rendering prompts. Now that's not ideal to have two prompts like that. There's some questions of like, well, can we get that down to one? If it's somewhat difficult, but it sort of depends on some of the privacy trade-offs that we're willing to work with. And I should emphasize that when you return to relying party and sign in again, that those wouldn't necessarily be there because the browser is aware that you've already granted permission and things can be streamlined. So this is generally the sign-up experience, or if you're signing in with a new browser or with a fresh profile on your browser, that you would have to see those. In the middle here, we still have the identity provider screen. And here we have the identity provider offering to say, well, do you want to provide your real email address or just like a fake email or a proxy email address that would forward to your real email address, which goes back to the directed identifiers that I already talked about. And you can imagine that if I say, if the user selects that they just want a proxy email address and only a directed identifier would be provided, then that reduces the tracking risk and could potentially remove the requirement for another browser permission prompt on the third frame there. So for mediation is the second approach, which is, as I said, the browser becomes a deeper part of this flow. And here you can see that in this example, given certain requirements are met, which is to say I'm signed in with that IDP with an active account and that has a valid session. When I click the sign in button, the browser can simply show me its own dialog, and I don't have to necessarily interact with the identity provider at all. Now, in some cases, you would have to, like if the identity provider needs you to sign in again or reauth, then you would still need a redirect. But this would require the browser to know a lot more about, have a deeper concept of what's happening. Like you'd have to know about your accounts. And the question is, if you had multiple accounts, would it offer an account chooser dialog, for instance? And because you have multiple emails to sign in from. And also, if I signed in, chose to sign in with a different, would have to show this screen again if I chose to sign in with a different account from the one I previously signed in with. Excuse me. So neither of those address the notion of tracking by the tracking capabilities that federated sign-in grants to an IDP, which I mentioned earlier. Simply the fact that you're using an IDP for sign-in tells the IDP all the sites that you're signing into, which is, constitutes user information and constitutes a profile to some extent of the user. The next step is to think about if we wanted to mitigate that, how would we do it? And that's the delegation-based approach. And now, essentially, I said that it redefines the role of the IDP in the ecosystem. And what it has done is that the browser has become an essential component. It's essentially become part of the identity provider. The identity provider delegates the ability to mint identity tokens to the browser. So therefore, the browser can issue them without the identity provider knowing who they're being issued to. Some variants of this have been, this is not entirely novel, some variants of this have been tried and even implemented before. But we're trying to mesh this with some of our other ideas, such as directed identifiers, and also trying to cover some cases like backup. I'm not going to fully go through this right now. This sort of this messy diagram sort of illustrates how we envision the protocol working. We've been trying to hash this out and modify it for a while now. But it's more of the point is that we're demonstrating that it can be done. It can work. Like we can do something if we throw out requirements for backward compatibility. Then we have this system by which the user agent can be granted a certificate to provide directed email address or to issue directed identifiers to prevent the joining problem and correlation by the relying party, and also hide from the identity provider who we're issuing these things to. Now, the server-side relying party backwards compatibility is something we think about quite a bit. We think of it sort of as a bright line. It's a lot easier to deploy if we don't require people to modify their current OpenID Connect servers or OAuth servers if they don't require any code changes to that. Basically, if we can in some way tunnel the existing protocols and hide from the endpoints that certain things have in the middle, this flow in particular doesn't need that at all. So one other thing I want to mention is that we've talked about sign-in a lot. We're also thinking about authorization, which is non-sign-in flows, which is think of it. I guess in my head I think of it. This is OAuth, but all the other things it does besides being a layer that OpenID Connect is built on. So OAuth is used for many things. People use it for Twitter. People use it for Google services, for Facebook all the time, and that's effectively you're granting capabilities other than simply being able to sign into a website. It's a lot harder for the browser to intermediate that because we simply can't anticipate all of the use cases. So we think it sort of degrades into a permission-based flow, although there's still questions about how well we can do with that. Going forward, there are a lot of challenges, open questions. One of the things is directed identifiers. So as we think that they are very good and useful, they provide users a lot more control. They are very privacy enabling. Relying parties are mostly fairly negative on them. They like to have users' real email addresses, and they may or may not be intending to join them and to create tracking profiles after the fact. But one example, there are a few reasons for that. One which we have written here is that customer support. If I sign into, if I go to a newspaper and I sign in using Federated Identity, and then I have a problem with my account, then I want to contact the newspaper and tell them who I am. I can't actually do that because they have a very specific directed notion of me. They don't necessarily know my full name unless I've told them outside of the flow, which defeated the point of direct identifiers, and they don't even know my real email address. So there needs to be ways to work around that, and it is going to carry some cost. We have technical questions like how easy is it to enforce directed identifiers? Right now, a lot of these identity flows happen through server-to-server communication. So effectively, when you do this action through the web, a token gets passed from the IDP to the RP. Then the RP contacts an API on the IDP's service to actually get the identity token, and the browser doesn't even see it. So if we're going to really think we need to enforce directed identifiers in a technical way, we can't allow that to happen, or we would have to assume that they're not directed if they do happen. And then there's the question of simply like, well, how useful is it if we simply require in policy that these direct identifiers are directed, and not not require that the user agent be able to verify it? Is that seems less good, but the question is how much, and these are this is part of contributing to the trade-offs that we're discussing. And then I had mentioned earlier the issues with enterprise, which we're giving some thought to as well. And we welcome feedback and engagement on this. This is the we're trying to reach out to stakeholders, the relying parties, identity providers, both public ones and enterprise-focused ones. There are companies that provide identity services. We're talking to other web browsers or browser implementers about how they're thinking about these problems and how they're prioritizing them, because everybody's thinking about privacy to some extent now. And the identity ecosystem is huge. It's been around for, I think OpenID Connect has been in deployment for about 10 years, but it's even much older than that, really. And yeah, feedback is welcome. So there's again a link to our VCG, the repository there. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you.